was talking about something about this rest.
It's good to be. That's what the things.
Good morning again.
Good morning.
We are moving into our Bible class time. I've been given the thumbs up that we are live, so welcome back to those who have switched over from the worship service to the Bible class time out in the Netherlands. This is typical for me for the last year and a half. I've either been teaching fully online, remote, or in person, so I'll take all three. So this is not going to be bad. Ezekiel. Study of Ezekiel. It's called Survey of Ezekiel for a reason. In case you haven't been in the book recently, there are 48 chapters in Ezekiel. We are not going to read every chapter in depth over the course of 13 weeks. But we're going to do a survey of Ezekiel. And hopefully we'll glean some lessons. There's a lot to learn. It is one of the longer books in the Bible. Also, obviously, one of the major prophets, which we'll talk a little bit more about. A lot of imagery, a lot of content we certainly can spend time with. And I trust we'll open some doors that maybe you in your personal studies will be able to explore a little bit more as well. But I did make the decision to focus on the survey rather than trying to go too in-depth. Because I'll be honest, I'm not sure how familiar most people are with the book of Ezekiel. If you are like me, maybe you've read it a time or two. I was baptized at the age of 13. In 42 years, I've never sat in on a class of Ezekiel. I've never taught a class of Ezekiel. And if you're doing the math, yeah, that makes me 55. Yeah. I figured it's time. Now, I can also say pretty confidently in my role in education previously in this congregation, the time that I have been here, we've never had a class on Ezekiel. Ever. We've missed out. So Joanna's very excited. We're having a class on Ezekiel. Yay! So I hope everyone will feel that way by the time we're done. As we go through and see what it's going to be like. There really is a lot of interesting material in Ezekiel. There's some ways, and I trust that I'll be able to do this, to present it and order it, that it's not really as complicated either as you might think on first blush. Now, with any of the books of prophecy, there's going to be some questions of what was I referring to? And hopefully we keep it in the big context. Shows, okay, I get the total context. I may not get all the minute details, but I think I get a big picture of what's going on. And so that's what we're going to try to do. I do have a class schedule. I'm going to put this out at the end. You don't need it today. It's really just a listing of the dates and the topics so that you'll know ahead of time. You can be preparing for a particular class where I will be in terms of content. Most weeks it's 3 to 4 chapter chunks. Okay, it's not terribly difficult. There are a few weeks as we get close to the end. We get into the prophecies against the nations. We're going to group a lot of those together. And then the very latter part of the book, a lot of the predictions of the future for Israel and some of the even forward-looking beyond Israel's time readings that we'll also group those together in larger sections. But I'll have those out and you're welcome to pick it up. The other thing on that form, on the back of it, is an outline of Ezekiel. It's not the exact outline I'm using, but it's close. But it gives you a little more detail. Okay, it breaks it down into a little bit more detail with some of the chapters and some of the content included within those chapters. Again, I trust that will help you for your own personal study. But that way, at least folks will know where we're going to be or try to be week to week. Of course, as I say with any good plan, once it hits the road, it's pretty much thrown out the window. So we'll see as we go week to week how I'm able to keep to it. It is my habit to use PowerPoints, illustrations. I will be doing that again with this class as well. If you want a copy of these, particularly those of you who are not here, if you want a copy of those or the outline that I've prepared, just send me an email. And I will send you the notes as we're done after each week, and I'll go ahead and send you the outline as soon as I get your email, if you would like to have it. So feel free to contact me using that. If you forget it after today, it's also in the directory, and you're welcome to contact me that way. Or if you just find my phone number and want to call me and ask me, I will answer my phone, maybe. Call my cell, don't call my work line. I never answer the phone at work. I know that sounds kind of weird, but I have people that do that for me. Yeah, they answer the phone and say, leave a message or call voicemail. Because you never know who you're going to get on that phone. So you just got to be real careful. At any rate, that is where we're at. All right, so what are we going to do today? We're not actually going to be digging too far into Ezekiel itself. We're going to do more of an overview. I want to start talking a little bit about why we study the Old Testament. For this group, probably for the most part, it's probably not that important or necessary to discuss some of these issues. But I think it's worthwhile to go back over and remind ourselves because there's so much in the Old Testament. And if we're not in it on a regular basis, we can tend to forget. I also want to go over some general notes on the prophets and their place in history and in our understanding, particularly from Scripture, of what roles they served and why they're important for us. Because we have several major prophet books. We've got Ezekiel now, we're going to pick up with Isaiah, another of the major prophets on Wednesday nights. And so lots of stuff we can learn from. It was helpful for me to talk about the timing as well as I did this study and put it together to realize, okay, how they kind of all fit together. It's not perfect, but we're going to look at an outline of timing of the prophets. And I'll tell you right now, the very first section is controversial. Okay? Because not everybody agrees on the timing of when some of these men lived and spoke and wrote. There's fairly good consensus, but it's not perfect. But that's okay. And then before we get done today, we will talk a little bit about the background of the book of Ezekiel, what was kind of happening in the timing. Because I think it's one of the more interesting books, again, if you haven't spent much time with it, of how much it covers, the time span that Ezekiel covers. From the captivity through living in exile to the prophecies of what's going to happen from there. So Jerusalem is destroyed while they are in exile. Ezekiel's telling them, this is coming. This is coming. And it happens. And then beyond that. In fact, there's more time after the destruction of Jerusalem that he's prophesying than before. And so dealing with that in a life. So we'll look at a little bit of the background and what of his writings. A little bit of information about the man himself. There's a few nuggets that we get from the opening chapter and a little bit more later in the book. And then just some general themes beyond. I've got a few from the general notes and the prophets I'll pull out, but then just within Ezekiel, which also highlight, I think, or parallel some of those general notes. So that's what we're going to pick up with this morning in terms of an overview to get started on this study of Ezekiel. Okay. So let's ask the simple question. Why do you study the Old Testament? Why do you study the Old Testament? So when I answer that question, what do you tell?
Because it lays a platform for the coming of Jesus Christ.
Okay, it gives us the foretelling of Christ as the Messiah, of God's salvation for us. Absolutely.
Well, there's so many references in the New Testament to things that were told in the Old Testament. So just cross-referencing prophecies, I guess.
Sure. Prophecies that we see referred to, brought to fulfillment in the New Testament, or told us this is what that prophecy was for. Connecting the old and the new, and it shows the divinity, the plan of God over time.
It shows me God's character in these dealings with people.
Okay?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It shows you who God is.
Yeah.
You can understand more about God from what happened in the Old.
Absolutely. That's one of the, I think, the critical messages of the prophets, of God telling us who He is. And for us, how God deals with His people. The Old Testament's full of that. The whole range of God's dealing with His people.
Well, I was going to say, so I don't make the same mistakes. And I get a lot of comfort when I see how God did prophesy, and He was there for His people, so that when I find myself in the same boat, I know there's still hope.
Right. Because we're people just like they are. We're the same human beings, same nature. We have the same struggles and challenges. And God's going to deal with us. The same way He dealt with them. Now, we have, because of that plan, we have the administration of His grace. He was graceful in the Old Testament. We're going to see that. He was incredibly graceful in the Old Testament. We have a better access to Him through Christ.
You can see in the comparison the way it is today, the way it was there. That's good comparison.
Sure. We compare lifestyles and see what their life is like. One more, go for it.
And it reveals to me that people have never changed.
Yeah.
The people that
Not a bit.
we are just like they were in the Old Testament.
Sweet word. All right, here's some of the easy answers we learn from it. Okay, we learned Romans 15:4. The Bible collectively is for our learning. That includes the Old Testament. But for our admonition, okay, to encourage us, as Craig was saying, it's to compare, to see how these things all fit together where we can. And let's accept right now there's going to be some elements, whether it's Ezekiel or other works, like, I still don't get it. Okay, I'm still trying to understand, I'm still struggling a little bit. God says, that's okay. It's part of understanding Him, understanding a divine being that's beyond us. He is more than we are. But He's given us glimpses and ways to help us begin to understand it. We have to grow into a knowledge and understanding of God. Because He's God. That's a simple thing to say, He's God. But to explain what that means, those two words, is incredible. Because it's beyond us. But that's why we have the Word. To help increase our knowledge of His holiness, His righteousness, His justice, mercy, key concepts, critical concepts for us to understand who and what God is and how God deals with His people. And the understanding of how He deals with the nations of men too. It's interesting in the Old Testament we forget, and we certainly don't probably think, well, maybe we do. I don't think about it as much today, God's dealings with His creation. Okay? He worked in and through these people. He's still working. Again, we may not understand it. A lot of things we'll pick up from the prophets, especially, and this has really struck me in the last few months as I've been preparing. We're going to see this phrase a lot. Then you will know that I am the Lord. And things are going to happen. The prophets are going to tell us, here's what's coming. I'm telling you now, it's going to happen. And unlike some of the other prophets in the Old Testament, some of the major prophecies, a lot of these happened in their lifetime. Ezekiel told them this is going to happen. It did. And the phrase, so they shall know that I'm the Lord. We learn from what God does after the fact. Oh. Then for Craig's point, do we take the lesson? And that to me is one of the most important elements we'll take, I think, in the study of Ezekiel, is my own personal dependence, belief, trust in God, because I'm learning these lessons.
There's purpose for what He does. It's not just that sometimes we think God just does things. He never just does something.
There's purpose, there's meaning, there's reason. Again, I don't always get it, I don't always see it in the moment, but that's why, looking back, and we have this book of history as well, that we can look back and realize, oh, yeah, and He's still in charge. He's still there, still in charge. A few general notes on the prophets. What they did, okay, what are the roles of the prophets? Not a lot of detail, but just some things to keep in mind. They were raised up to call people to remembrance, repentance, obedience. Okay? Prophets need to remind folks that they are God's people. And He has particular plans for them. And that they weren't fulfilling their charge, the responsibilities He would like them to. They were to bring them back. Major themes that you'll see throughout all the prophets and lessons that we can take from them. They're just saying God is the ruler of all history. Okay, He is the Lord of all. That has been, that is, that will be. And our history books are a great remembrance of the prophets, are a great reminder of that He is above all. And again, one of the things that struck me from Ezekiel, it's also in Jeremiah, it's in Isaiah. Prophecies against the other nations. It's not just His chosen people, it's His creation He's dealing with. He's working in them, through them, using them to teach as well. Again, they don't realize that He's in control, but He is. And that's helpful for us because we read the New Testament, at some point, every knee will bow. Okay? Truth is, whether I accept it or disagree with it, it is. Christ is Lord. I'll accept it now, or I will know it surely beyond this physical life. It is. It is. Because of that, relationship with God is critical. Okay, being right with God. The prophet's going to remind the folks of that. Now, in some instances for them, there was a real immediate physical consequence, okay, of that failure to be obedient, that failure to live in right with Him. The other one I would suggest, and again, several commentators pose some of the same ideas. Who we are, how we live. Our societies, our lives, our ability to live together or not, the moral foundation really of this creation. It's got to be based on God or it doesn't work. We see that through history. It doesn't work. And His plan, His design, He's got this for us if we'll live, if we'll learn. And we've got these wonderful examples. We just have to study them. We have to read them and come to understand the lessons that are there. And it's not always easy, okay? We have to work at it a little bit because the way some of these books are written, some of the prophecies, the way the utterances were given to us, and we're looking at times in other cultural contexts, what did that mean? Books of poetry, apocryphal literatures. But that's really sticky, okay? And it's worthwhile to help us know and understand. Okay? Number one. As Matt mentioned, Without the prophets, we don't have an understanding of what was to come. God told us before it happened, this is what's going to happen. This is what I'm preparing for you. Now, in terms of the Jewish nation, didn't quite get it right initially. Not what they expected, what they wanted it to look like. This is God's Messiah. This is His plan for salvation. And He's given it to us. And a lot of the prophets, Ezekiel not so much. This is kind of an interesting counterpoint to what you'll see starting with Craig's study of Isaiah. A lot of messianic content in Isaiah. Ezekiel not as much. Okay, it's a lot more for us to see God's dealing with His nation, for them to understand, and for us to understand His interaction with His people, what was going to be coming. And then the hope of restoration. That's certainly an important part of Ezekiel. For them, okay, the remnant will return to Israel. You'll go back. Some will go back. But then he does point to beyond. There's some messianic content on that, but at least much as in some of the other prophets. The big picture, and Craig, I don't know if you're trying to do this or not in yours as well, but if you do want to repeat it, that's fine. Okay. We've got 4 major prophets in the Old Testament. Okay, 4 major prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Okay, 4 major prophets. We've got the 12 minor prophets.
Which one of the majors is your favorite?
Is my favorite? Always been partial to Daniel. Actually, I was debating, and I went through 2 studies over the last almost a year. Am I going to do Daniel or Ezekiel? Daniel or Ezekiel. And it finally came down to I've never done Ezekiel. I've got to do Ezekiel. Got to do it. So, 12 minor prophets. I will not list them in alphabetical order. Hosea, Joel, Amos. I wrote them down. I'm cheating. Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Keep in mind the designation, notes the length, not the importance. How do we teach our kids that? It's really a simple designation. Why is it a major prophet? Because it's long. It's a minor prophet because it's short. I found a new tidbit. I'd never heard this before, never come across it. You know who's credited with that distinction? Who called them major and minor prophets? I have no idea if this is true, but I've seen it in several different sources, so at least enough people think it's true to repeat it. So I'll repeat it too. Have you ever heard? I had never heard.
Webster?
No. Augustine. Augustine is credited with designating, these are major prophets, these are minor prophets. That's it. You get one sentence. I found like 6 different commentaries. Oh yeah, Augustine said this. No other background, no other information. I don't know if it's true or not. No clue. Maybe it is. We do have other prophets, of course, in the Old Testament that are named but do not have books. You've got Elijah, Elisha, Nathan. Depending on how you want to categorize him, Samuel we associate more with history than prophecy, but Samuel was certainly a prophet. If you want to think of him in that group as well. He does have 2 books, but again, we tend to put those with the history books as well. All right, here's the troubling part. The timing of the prophets. So all those different folks we just listed, kind of where do they sit and how do they work together or how do they position themselves? This is one presentation. It's not perfect, like I said, and it's okay if I'm not sure I agree with all that. That's fine. I'm not going to get upset because there's some I still question, but again, there's enough. I can make an argument for why I've got them in this order, and that's I teach our students, especially when doctoral students, they have to defend their work. You have to defend it. It can be reasonable. I may not agree with it, but if it's reasonable, okay. And we'll move on, and we can choose to disagree. But this first group in the early Assyrian period, about the 9th century, more or less, Obadiah and Joel. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is the most controversial date, these 2. There's very strong cases for these 2 to have written later, okay, more around the 6th century. Okay? Depends on which evidence you want to fall into. I like the evidence for the older writings personally, and so I tend to associate them as some of the oldest prophets, or in terms of the oldest writings. If you believe that evidence, then Obadiah is typically considered to be the writings of the oldest in terms of the prophets. And during the 8th century, what we'll call the Assyrian period, and why that designation? Well, keep in mind what was kind of happening. During the early Assyrian period, that's when we have the divided kingdom within Israel in their history, the north and the south. And you have the empire of Assyria beginning to exert its influence and presence. And then during the 8th century, very strong, this would be in the period when the northern kingdom fell, when Assyria took over the northern kingdom. around 722. So these prophets would have been living and working in that time, operating, writing, and sharing their messages at those points in time. And I should say, I didn't mention this earlier, my apologies, the dates are not their lifelines. It's associated with their writing times, when we try to date those books back to. These are the more common dates associated with the prophets in these periods. When you come to the 7th century, the Chaldean period, you've got Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk. Okay, as Babylon is beginning to exert its world dominance at that time and take over, you have a lot of foretelling. This is coming. This kingdom is coming, and they will be taking over. They will be destroying, in this case, Israel specifically. Which would move us into the 6th century with the exile, period of the exile. And of course, the two key writers of that time would be Daniel and Ezekiel. They were contemporaries. And we'll get a little bit more of the history here in just a little bit of where those two were at and their crossover. And then looking beyond the exile to the 6th and 5th centuries, there is some crossover. Again, they're not perfect structures. You have Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Of course, Haggai and Zechariah going back with the remnant to help rebuild the temple, rebuild Jerusalem, reestablish the nation, and then later Malachi dealing more with the issue of the priesthood in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, so there's big picture context. Where all this is coming from. Very brief history of Israel, the prophets, and what's happening with them. It is I think, a very informative study to kind of go back and line up the prophets and kind of see who was talking when and where some of the crossover lies. It also fits really well if you're doing a study of the kings to see which prophets are associated with the various kings of Israel in order to see the influence. Because not all elements are recorded, obviously, in one single book, so we have to look across books. Ezekiel's easy. There's no major kings of Israel. They don't exist for a while, other than the kings that Nebuchadnezzar left in place, and then the ones that, and then when they return, there's still no king. There's a governor. All right. So looking at the background of Ezekiel, the historical political context, if you will, the 10 northern tribes have been carried off into Assyrian captivity. They no longer are a nation per se. But the southern tribes are still there in the land, in the promised land. They were spared basically because of Hezekiah's righteous rule during his period of time. But in Israel, just after the Assyrian captivity for the northern tribes, or the northern kingdom, Manasseh comes to the throne. And if you study again the history of the kings and the rule of Manasseh, again, quite interesting. This is the one that pushed it over the edge because of Manasseh and the involvement in idol worship, going even so far as to sacrifice children as part of the idol worship. This is the proclamation during his reign. God said, that's it. You will be done. You will be going into captivity. And from that point forward, you begin to see more of the prophecies about the end of the Israelite nation. At least their departure, or their deportation, the destruction of the city, the destruction of the temple. It's coming. Now, it's a bit ironic, again, if you say Manasseh, most people don't. Again, you got to read through the multiple books. He was terrible. He was one of the worst, if not the worst, of the southern kings. But he actually repented at the end. He repented of his sins. Now, there are still consequences, and they went on. But he did turn around at the end of his life. His following Manasseh was Josiah, who restored proper worship to God. Proper worship of God in the temple, trying to destroy the high places. And just a quick side note, if you've read through the Old Testament books, particularly the Kings and Chronicles, you always see these references to high places, okay, where they would go to sacrifice to other gods in their idolatry, the high places, the high places. Throughout the entire history of the southern kingdom, there's only 2 kings that actually destroyed all the high places. Hezekiah and Josiah. All the other kings, even if they were reasonably good kings and tried to follow God, didn't try to stop the people in some of their idolatry, other than Josiah and Hezekiah. 2 shining spots in their history. Because following Josiah, you have Jehoahaz, who comes right back in and they return to idol worship. Okay, it's that cycle is repeated continually throughout Israel's history. As Craig mentioned, hopefully we will learn from it. Matter you and I could sit down, we could talk about how many things we've made the same mistake.
I say not gonna happen.
And over, and over. We struggle. Okay, we struggle. That's where grace comes in. We can learn. But there are consequences, obviously, too, of sin and mistakes in our lives. So we need to be very aware of that. So what's happening? So we're degenerating. From Manasseh into the next set of kings, they're degenerating other than with Josiah. And just moving toward that time when God will bring Babylon to destroy Jerusalem and take people captive. Jehoiakim was the king taken first after Jehoahaz. He ruled for 11 years, and in his 4th year is when the exile happened, or the first deportation. That's when Daniel was taken. Guessing Ezekiel was probably about 17 or 18 years old when Daniel and that first deportation took place. That's what the historians suggest, that it happened during that period of time. So Ezekiel would have been in Israel. I'm just thinking, but I don't know that it ever actually suggests where he was at in Israel. Probably in Jerusalem. His father was a priest in the servant line, so he probably was in Jerusalem. I don't think there's actually been speculation about that. I hadn't thought about that before this particular moment. But anyway, we'll see. Then moving forward just a little bit in time, Jehoiachin, son of Jehoiakim, he ruled for 3 months, and he was taken to Babylon during the same deportation with Ezekiel. So this would have been the second deportation. That's when Ezekiel ends up in captivity, and he does his prophesying from captivity, okay, in Babylonian captivity. Zedekiah was then installed as king, and he ruled till the destruction of Jerusalem. He was put in place by the Babylonians. He tried to revolt, and we'll see some of that, and they tried to get Egypt to come in and help them, and so as Babylon came in and was defeating Israel, fighting against Jerusalem, they just took a side trip and went down and battled Egypt as well. And then came back and finished the destruction of Jerusalem. So again, most of it takes place during the Babylonian captivity, the 70 years. Ezekiel was in Babylon during the time of his prophesying and the writing that we have. The book covers about a 22 to 23 year period, depending on how you do the dating. Most will agree to this. Yeah, it's at least 22. Some will say no, it's really 23, but they're pretty good about one of those 2 dates. The first date of Ezekiel that we have pretty good confidence in is during the 5th year of his exile. And then in the writing of Ezekiel itself, the last, again, reasonably strong message that's dated comes 27 years later. Or 28, depending on which piece you want to believe. So 22 to 23 years. He started prophesying before the destruction of Jerusalem. That's important. That's going to be really key for us as we move forward. That before it happened. Because think about their history. You know, you go from the group that left the wilderness to take over the promised land, to take possession of the land, and the ups and downs with trying to rid the land of the people that were already there. And then they move into the period of the kings, and the back and forth, during the period of Saul, fairly stable, certainly with David, very stable, and Solomon, then back and forth, okay, as they deal with the 4 nations around them. Back and forth, of idolatry and other kingdoms and what they're doing. And the threats, you know, remember what God said. If you continue in this vein, you will lose it all. Now here we have one of the first glimpses of God's patience. We did a small group study sometime last year. I can't remember the exact date of when we were doing it. But I asked the group, what characteristic of God stands out to you the most? What characteristic of God stands out to you the most? If you really think about it. And the group almost unanimously, not quite, but almost unanimously, patience. Because if you really stop and think about it, how patient God is with me, and that's what's illustrated through the Old Testament, and his patience with his people. He wants to be in relationship, wants to be right, but he's a holy God. And that has parameters that we have to learn and understand in order to be in relationship with him. It's his desire, but there are parameters that have to be met. So Ezekiel's telling us before it happens, because they've heard this through their history, you know, the curses, the destructions that could come. They've seen Israel defeated. They've seen Jerusalem defeated in battles. And they've been plundered over time. He said, no. This is going to be different. And he will be the first to forecast or to predict the destruction of the temple. Okay, as far as I knew, this would always be. This was where God came and put his presence. And he will prophesy and forecast the removal of that presence. And so that's where we're getting some of the interesting imagery. There's some really fantastic imagery in Ezekiel, and some of it's kind of tough to wade through, but we will. Okay, because the substance and the pictures and the ideas are just to get to the points. We don't have to get caught up in the details of what does the picture look like, and what's the message he's trying to give us with this vision. We have in the New Testament too, there's some visions that aren't really that clear or that easy to understand. Paul talks about his vision that he's not even going to explain it to us. He said, I had a vision. Okay? And this is the big picture of it, but I'm not even going to try to explain it to you. Okay? But here's the point. So we'll focus on the point. So he tells them what's going to happen before it does, and then after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the destruction of the temple, he continues to prophesy. And that's where we shift from, this is where the interesting breakdown of Ezekiel, you go from, there's bad news, it's really bad news. I mean, really bad news. You're already in captivity. Okay? The city's going to get destroyed, the temple's going to get destroyed. Settle in. This is one of the important messages of Ezekiel. Settle in. Telling the Israelites, live here, prosper, and then there will be remnant back. So we shift from the message of destruction and doom to the message of restoration and hope. Ezekiel will cover the range for these people. For them. There will be a remnant to go back. That God will not forget. Okay? There has to be consequences for how they have treated him, how they've treated his temple. And perhaps more so than the other prophets, Ezekiel really focuses on what happened around their spiritual worship, or their lack of. And the defilement of the temple, the defilement by the priests, just the people, and then their practices. How they are so averse to God that there has to be consequences. And that's what he brings them to, okay, for that destruction. All right, a little bit about Ezekiel. And these tidbits are drawn from the book itself. And I've tried to put in the references as we come across them. Is the son of, I say boozy, I don't know if that's right. I don't know if it's buzzy. I've heard, you can run those little phonetics on your internet, and it'll give you different translations or different pronunciations of it. Son of Buzzy. He was a priest. He is in the line of the priest. Ezekiel is a priest by descent. A serving priest. That's important. Okay, not just a helping priest, but a serving priest that would be involved in the worship and the sacrificial system. So we see his designation in 1:3, the son of Buzzi. His naming is God will strengthen. God will strengthen. That will almost be a literal use of his name when he gives him his charge to speak to the Israelites, to speak to your people, speak to your own people about what's happening, about why they're there, about how they need to live moving forward. So, but they're not going to want to listen. Much like with Jeremiah, they're not going to want to listen. Okay? So he has to be strengthened. He has to be hardened to be able to continue. Remember, 22, 23-year period of time he's going to prophesy. And for the most part, nobody wants to listen. Okay? That's not unusual with the prophets because, remember, calling them to remembrance, to repentance, and to obedience. Hey, you've been trying it your way, it's not working. You need to come back to God and live according to his direction. They didn't want to hear it. So his name is too strict. Again, they speculate that most commentators, historians, that he was taken into captivity at age 25. That would have been during the second deportation. The book opens, again, if we trust the dating and we accept it in chapter 1, verse 1, in the 5th year. And that tends to refer to the 5th year of his exile. So he was taken captive, taken into captivity to the deportation into Babylon, was there for 5 years, then God calls him. Then he's called to begin his ministry, if you will, at the age of 30. At the age of 30. If you want to get into symbolism, well, the age of 30 is typically when the priests would begin their service. Find in Numbers, chapter... where's it at? I didn't write it down. Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't write it down. Sorry. It's in Numbers. I'll find it for next week. But they were typically called to service at age of 30. We know he was married in chapter 24, but we have no information about the family. The only reason we know he's married because one of the episodes of Ezekiel's life, God tells him, your wife is going to die, but you can't mourn for her. This is one of the dramatic acts that Ezekiel will live out for the people of Israel, for them to see. This is what it's going to be like for those when Jerusalem is destroyed. And so we know he was married, but that's all we know, and that she died during this period of time. He was a contemporary of Jeremiah, who was in Jerusalem. Remember, he's the one that stayed in captivity. He was a contemporary of Daniel, who was in Babylon. He preceded him. They were not in the same physical location, but they were both under Babylonian captivity. Of course, Daniel being in the ruling city. He's with the king, while Ezekiel is out basically living by the river with captives around Kibar. Also of Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. Again, they're all in the same period of overlapping. The writings aren't exactly the same in terms of when their books and their prophecies, but they were all alive at the same time. And then a few themes, I think just within Ezekiel. We mentioned a few general ideas for the prophets, and they're certainly reflected in Ezekiel. I think some of them are highlighted even more so, or at least for our attention. Again, the sovereignty of God and His holiness. This is throughout the Old Testament. They particularly, you can pick up any of the Old Testament books, and there's going to be something in there about God's sovereignty, His holiness, His rule over the people, over the nations. And from this very first chapter in Ezekiel, we're basically slapped in the face with God's presence. And this is one of the challenging elements of Ezekiel. When you read the first chapter, you're all of a sudden you're lost. The imagery is just, it's over the top. It really is. But that's to convey, you've got the divine presence now invading, if you will, or coming into the physical space. That's hard to get a head around. God revealing Himself to Ezekiel. That's what chapter 1 is. He gets Ezekiel's attention because he's about to give him a charge. And Ezekiel recognizes it. He knows right away what he's seeing. May not be able to explain it real well, but he knows what he's seeing. And so that's presented for us, His holiness, His sovereignty. In this book, specifically in Ezekiel, about 65 times you'll find the phrase, then they will know I am the Lord. I mentioned that earlier. They will know I am the Lord. Okay. He's reiterating for them, I am God. And because of what you're going to tell them and what they're going to experience, then they're going to know. And one of the lessons I'll come back to over the course of this quarter for us is this struggle of, I know it intellectually, I can understand it, but do I live it? Do I live it? I think that's one of the important lessons here, that God is sovereign. You've got to keep that, because it's too easy not to let that permeate who we are. Just let it flip to the back of our mind, because we get busy at work, with school, with family, with activities. There's just so many other things going on. That I'm important. These things are important. They are important. But God is still sovereign above all that. So this lesson is repeatedly reinforced because we have to be repeatedly reminded. Because we're hard-headed too. We mentioned already, we're people just like they were people. We are. And so it's important for us to continue to learn this lesson. Another phrase that's used a lot in this context, in this theme, in Ezekiel, again, depending on your translation, the numbers may not be exact, but I've done most of mine through the NIV, just so you'll know in terms of translations I'm looking at. Approximately 64 times you're going to find the phrase, thus says the Lord, or thus says God. Okay? Again, who's the message coming from? He's going to remind them. Ezekiel, that's how he opens most of his presentations, or most of his speech, his prophecies, or the dramatic acts that we'll learn about as we go through. There's a couple of very interesting things about Ezekiel. I won't jump ahead too far. But one, you got to understand, wrap your head around it, because when you read it, you might not think about it, but you got to keep pulling it through. When he's given his call, God tells him, you will now only speak when I have a message for you. Okay, so a big part of his 22 years, he's only speaking when God gives him a message to speak. You got to keep that in mind. That, okay, we're reading this prophecy, but the rest of the time, he's not talking. That was part of the demonstration, part of them to see God speaking through Ezekiel. He shut his mouth. And there's a very clear point in the book. He says, now he's loosed his tongue. Okay, when that stops and he's able to speak on his own through other times. There's a period of these years where he only speaks when he's got a message from God. That's interesting. That's dramatic. You know, we see a very small snippet of that with John's father, no blank. It starts with a Z. The priest in the New Testament. Zephaniah? No. Zechariah. Thank you. Zechariah. No. He questioned God a little bit. He said, I'll tell you what, why don't you just be quiet until John's born, and then you'll know. Then they will know. Okay, it's the same type of sign. And this is happening because God's working, and when it's done, you'll understand. So we'll see quite a bit of that in Ezekiel. Okay, so with this theme, just a little breakdown here. Chapters 1 through 24. God's using the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple to reveal himself for his people. Okay? You will know that I am God when you see this city fall, when you see this temple destroyed. Okay, over the course of 24 chapters, that's the theme. That's a big theme for them. Chapters 25 through 32, we're going to get into the pronouncements, the prophecies of the other nations. And God's saying, you all see, not just Israel, but the other nations will see what happens to Israel. And then God's going to turn and say, oh, you, and you, and you, all the other nations and their treatment of Israel and their disregard of God, and says, you're going to have a consequence too. And to a great extent, he's using Babylon to destroy a lot of the other nations. And this is just going to keep going. It's not just going to be Israel. It's not just going to be the Jewish nation. It's not just going to be Jerusalem and their temple. It's going to be you too. And one of the things I find interesting about some of those prophecies, remember Ezekiel is in Babylon. And he's telling Egypt, this is going to happen to you, but I don't think they hear the message. Because they're not there to get the word. But we're given it, they're given it, so when they learn of what happened, God's sovereign. God's still in control. A very important lesson. And then the latter part of Ezekiel, chapters 33 through 48, is that promise of restoration. For the Jews, you are going back. There will be a remnant to go back, and then some of the messianic elements looking forward in God's hope for his people. And it wouldn't really be a study of the Old Testament if we didn't recognize the sinfulness of people. Okay? Sinfulness of Israel in particular. Again, those first 24 chapters, this is what it's all about. And I find this a bit interesting. You know, people give God a bad rap, you know, in some of the Old Testament dealings, and there's some harsh consequences. But God takes time in Ezekiel to say, here's why. Here's why. Okay? As Greg said, this is not just on a whim. This just didn't happen. Okay? God planned this. He knew this was coming. And his patience, he gave them so much time to be right. They wouldn't do it. Not that they couldn't, they wouldn't do it. So Ezekiel's telling him, this is on us. And so he's calling out their sin and helping us realize, I need to pay attention to sin in my life because it's for real. And it separates me from God as we know. So we've got to deal with that. Then comes the fact of judgment. This is a very critical lesson too in Ezekiel. Because of the sin, there's consequences. The consequences for them is going to be the judgment. Now, they're already experiencing it to some degree. That's why Ezekiel's telling them, settle in. This is not going to be over tomorrow. In 70 years. 70 years, you're going to be here. There is a judgment, and it is coming, and it's happening. And they will again see the judgment happening in some context. And we don't get that with all the other prophets. So many are so forth-telling. They're looking far ahead in the future. We don't see some of that. But Ezekiel covers that span. That first period, Jerusalem's going to fall, the temple's going to be destroyed, these other nations are going to be destroyed, and they live it. They get the news, they hear it, they see it, and you've got the living prophecies working out for them. But it always comes back, full circle, promise of restoration. Twofold for the Israelites, in the sense of their return to Israel, their return to Jerusalem, the temple will be rebuilt, the nation will be reestablished. It will not be the same. They will learn the lesson. You've probably heard this in other classes, and I hope you realize and pick it up. The captivity did wonders for the mentality of Israel in the sense of, idol worship. Okay? I wouldn't go so far as to say they were never idolatrous again, because they were. But not to foreign gods. Their idolatry is more of their self-gods. Okay? And their idolatry with the law itself. They didn't serve other gods when they got back. They didn't always serve God faithfully. Okay? But we didn't go back to the high places. We didn't go back to the shrines. Okay? The lesson of the captivity was learned in that respect. Okay? So the nation would be restored. But beyond that, and this is where again we tie into the Messianic hopes, expectations, that there's more to come. God's dealing with people across time. That plan of salvation. In that right relationship. The chance for it to be restored too. So, it's an interesting book. There's a lot of stuff in it. And hopefully with the survey we'll be able to pull out some of those nuggets and glean for us some of the lessons and applications. Learning to depend more on God, to live in independence on God. To recognize, I've got to pay more attention. Because I'm people just like they were people. And I need to see these and understand it. All right, so next week we're going to start in on chapter 1. And ideally I'm going to cover chapters 1 through 3. That's the idea. That's the goal for next week. And so I'm going to leave these in the back. These, again, are just an outline of the weeks with the chapter and the date designations. You're welcome to take one if you would like. And then we will pick up next week in chapters 1 through 3. Thanks, everyone.